So we've been jumping into some new tactica. For those of you new to Battletech, certain fundamentals. Yes, absolutely, we want to jump into the mechs, start building our lance, lock and load, roll the dice, get the action going. But understanding, and I'm all for the narrative. I love the Battletech narrative. But there is behind the scenes the DNA of the game, how it operates with various modifiers, building modifiers and removing modifiers. That's important to understand so that you can make the correct tactical decisions, or at the same time just say, look, I know what I'm getting myself into. The odds are very, very small, but I'm going to go for that glory. I'm going to try and do that. And in this vlog, we're going to explore terrain and how terrain affects the various modifiers and various tactica in Battletech, because what's interesting about Battletech compared to other wargaming systems that you might play is there's a duality to the terrain with how it operates. It's more than just the visuals or battlefield dressing. It can interact with the tech, literally the weapons and the capabilities of your mech, to allow you to do some very, very interesting things. So this is about building awareness. Now, before we kind of jump into terrain, two great ways to play Battletech, and I encourage playing both, and I play both ways, looking at a hex map versus a traditional wargaming table with miniature trees and blown up buildings and stuff like that. The difference between the two, I find, is that tactically before the game starts, hex maps are really, really easy. And that's what's great about the hex maps. They look fantastic. You roll them out, you unfold them, you play level 1 building, level 1 hills, light woods, heavy woods, water, everything is marked out. And because there's hexes, there is no dispute. I mean, it's an exact understanding. Like, is it in the way? Do you have this ability? Can you do this or that? What's the facing? When you move to a wargaming table, it's a little bit more abstract. I mean, it really depends on the angle that you're at. If you have a blown up building that's higher on one side, your mech's on that side, but I'm on the other, from your vantage point, you might be obscured. But from mine, if I get down and look tabletop, I don't think you are. So what I find with the traditional wargaming table setup is two things really quick. Ahead of time, just discuss with your opponent. What does this represent? What is this going to be? So this way, there's expectations that are understood. And second, you know what? If it comes down to it, I want to win on glory alone. So if it comes down to it and you think you have cover, or I believe you don't have cover, I'll give it to you. I'll give it to you because I don't want to win just on some misunderstanding on that. So I find a good house rule is, when in doubt, rule in the favor of your opponent. And it might be a game changer. It might. But look, that's Battletech. That's the way things go. So tactically, the idea behind terrain, the first aspect in Battletech is cover and modifiers. When two mechs are facing towards each other and I'm shooting at you, I hit you with a PPC, we roll on this matrix chart to see where it hits. Does it hit your left leg, your right arm, your center torso, left torso, head? And what that represents is the fact that these mechs, as big as they are very dynamic. They are moving very fast. Yes, I've got a targeting system. To what degree is that? Well, it depends on the mech, depends on the design. Inner Sphere versus clans. I mean, there are a couple of... I played a Shadowhawk in a campaign. I had a primitive Shadowhawk that I inherited in this. It was kind of a half tabletop Battletech, half RPG Battletech a number of years ago. And I had iron sights because it was literally like, here's this relic that I could utilize as a media mech. I could maybe sell it and get enough C-bills to jump into a proper light mech, an updated light mech. And I was thinking about doing that for a Jenner, but I wanted the tonnage and the ability to customize and upgrade. But I had iron sights. So there is this idea that I'm trying to shoot you, but you're not like just standing there. That's why the difference is in the hips and where you hit. And not to mention that a mech itself moves a little bit different than a human. I might be walking forward, but I can certainly torso twist out to the side, which might mean instead of hitting me center where you were aiming at that last second, I twisted and you hit on the left. So that's a little bit of the understanding, because that can be a little bit confusing to new players. So when you're obscured by terrain, this is solid terrain, level 1, or based on the height of your mech. What that means is when I shoot at you, if it hits the left or right leg, the terrain piece absorbs that. Now, it might transfer to a building and blow up and fall down. It might just be soaked up if you're playing more generic rules or if it's a lower elevation. But that right away is just cutting down the odds. That cuts down the odds of getting hit in your legs tremendously. Hide behind some terrain. I can shoot at you. You can shoot back at me, but I have something to soak it up. And what's equally interesting is the fact that getting hit in the legs is bad in that, yes, it cuts down movement. Well, it's bad to get hit anyway, right? It cuts down on movement, but if you get a leg blown off, and some mechs do have a lot of armor in the legs, and they tend to blow up before the leg gets blown off. But if your leg gets blown off, the mech's not out of the game, but it is extremely, extremely crippled. Extremely crippled. So if I can just ignore all those shots, that's huge. So what you see, if you look at the hex map, and if you look at your traditional wargaming table, you're going to see pockets of terrain. Unless it's city fight, urban, dense, which is a different type of terrain, fantastic playing city tech, city fight. Most terrain is in these pockets, which means mechs will move from pocket to pocket. You'll want to dominate pocket to pocket. There'll be spaces where, depending on the fluidity, we see some just classic old school military type tactics, essentially kind of World War II type tactics where you'll have a fire team and another team that'll outflank. So if you move up your mechs, and this is kind of understanding visually where ahead of time, visually where the action's going to take place on the table. If there's two lower buildings that are going to obscure your legs, you move up there with, I'm just thinking of two mechs off the top of my head, a rifleman and a Jaeger mech. You move up there, you're like blah, 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 blasting away, got a nice little fire base. If I move up with an archer and say a marauder and trade fire, well, I'm going to kind of eventually lose that because I'm not partially obscured. You've got a good position. Your mechs are geared up to shoot. You're not going to leave that area. If you do, then maybe you're on unequal footing. You can hold more by being there. So then if I have you down, that's the fire team suppressing you. Then if I take my hovercraft, my mediums, my faster stuff, and outflank you, you now have a choice. Pull back, well, then I'll move forward with my fire team. I mean, just classic kind of World War II well-known tactics. You'll see that a lot in Battletech because especially with the hex maps, most of the hex maps, although a few of the new Catalyst maps are very dense and not city fight, city tech, this idea of the pockets of terrain. So you're going to look ahead of time, and based on your mechs and based on your opponent's mechs, and then layer over the mission if it's known, you're going to kind of get an idea where the action goes down. So the next type of terrain can also add cover modifiers, potentially a +1 or, depending on the rules, +2 to hit. General, so it represents the fact that maybe your mech is partially obscured. If you're in a terrain hex and you're obscured, you're kind of hiding behind the terrain that's in there, maybe trees that are in there. So it gives a modifier of a +1 or more, depending to hit. That's big too. I mean, Battletech, your scale is limited to the 2d6s. So everywhere you can stack up +1, +2, +4 to it, before you know it, your opponent is hitting on 8, 9, 10, 11, 12s, or 10, 11, 12s, or 11 and 12s, before the action really comes head to head. So being able to utilize terrain, that's the first aspect. And I think for many of us that are war gamers, we're familiar with this understanding that, terrain gives you cover. The rules might implement it a little bit differently. Terrain might protect you in some ways. The rules might implement it differently. But now we jump over to elevation. And this is where things get interesting with Battletech, because many of the weapon profiles and the tech in Battletech can take advantage of this. And this is kind of really big to understand. So we see elevation, and again, it's marked on a hex map, makes it very easy. Jumping over to a traditional wargaming table, maybe you determine ahead of time, or you decide it is WYSIWYG, certainly work that out. But level 1, level 2, level 3, or potentially level infinite. Drop ships are considered kind of level infinite with how they work if you have those on the table. This idea that if you have a mech, depending on its size, or if you have vehicles depending on its size, you might be behind a mountain or a hill and be completely obscured, meaning, visually your opponent knows you're there because they can see the miniature, sensor readings or intel recon, but they can't directly hit you. So then you have to go to indirect fire. This now opens up tactical possibilities. Look at an Archer, 2 long-range missile 20 packs stock, or another mech that has indirect fire capability. And this represents with the long-range missiles, you have a spotter, a unit that's acting as a spotter, relaying that information back, and you're firing on the general area. Now, it adds modifiers to hit, and it judges cover a little bit differently, interprets cover a little bit differently, but this is a massive tactica. This is a massive tactica if you have a number of long-range missiles. Did I say short-range missiles before? I meant long-range missiles. We're going to talk about SRMs in a second. Long-range missiles to be able to just shoot and shoot and shoot. If you have the battle value and you're playing Total Warfare Combined Arms, you take some long-range missile carriers. They're a little bit pricey, but they're pushing out 60 missiles a turn real time. Take 2 or 3 of those. That's some crazy Russian World War II stuff, firing those missiles out there. That's intense. And you can have them behind there that as mechs approach, they can't see. They can't see it. Now, in theory, they could indirect you back. Of course, opening in aerotech and flying units, based on their elevation, they can see over it. But this idea of Battletech is actually 3D, and the weapon profiles are important. We also see tactically where you'll see pockets of terrain. If there's terrain in the center of the table that is elevation on levels, and I can get some short range, some SRM missile carriers up there, either zooming them up or hidden deployment or maybe transporting them up there, that's a major threat bubble. That is a major, major threat bubble because you can only indirect me. You've got to go around that part of the map or bypass it, and I'm going to soak you with those missiles. So you do see elements where now you're hidden and you can pop out, and mechs are fast. Vehicles can be fast, very, very dynamic, very, very fluid. On the opposite side, the elevations allow you to climb and move up. Now, it's going to cost you some movement points. There's some rules depending on a mech versus a vehicle. We'll push that aside. But now what you see is this idea, if you're at a higher elevation, you can draw a line of sight over lower elevations. So there might be points on the hex map where your opponent is relatively well hidden. They have assets building up. They're looking to move somewhere, and you suddenly pop up on some higher elevation terrain. Could be a building, could be a hill, could be part of a mountain, and you're blasting away with autocannons and missiles from that perspective. And all of a sudden, that changes the dynamic. But likewise, that dynamic changes that dynamic because you're like on top of this hill, king of the hill. Everybody could potentially draw a line of sight back to you. So understanding how terrain in Battletech influences the modifiers, adding or subtracting, and then also hides or obscures or changes elevation for other units in the game, and how tactically that is going to work. But looping back in to that starting point, for those of you new to this game, take out a hex map or look at some of the hex maps online, and it's an interesting, quick little exercise. Think to yourself, okay, just looking at this map before we know the mission, what are the tactical hotspots? And do you make the decision to go up there and take that and hold it? Do you bypass it? Do you let your opponent castle up and hit them with the fire team and then the outflank? What do you do tactically? Start to build up those answers, at least ask those questions. And then from there, look at the different missions you might play or some of the different missions in the books, the TAC Ops, and figure out, how does this mission shift? How does this mission change? Because what we have to do in Battletech is understand that we're kind of morphing back and forth. In that moment when we activate a mech and we're rolling to hit, and we're just like, yes, just awesome PPCs and missiles, just really, really cool stuff. You are in the role of a mech warrior. You know, you're in there in the moment, pressing those buttons and using that targeting computer or iron sights. But then in the initiative phase, you're pulling out and you're a mech commander. You know, you're up there in the dropship, space pod, command center, mobile HQ, whatever it's going to be, wherever you are. I'm always on the front line. I'm in that Cyclops front line. Wherever you're going to be, you're looking at that little Tactica map, or you're pushing around your little miniatures back in the mobile HQ, and you're making those decisions of where things need to go, looking beyond just the immediate turn tactically, but the next turn, the next turn, the next turn, and making those decisions, all modified by terrain, all understanding the DNA in the background, how the metrics and everything works for Battletech.